In 2025, Charlie Sheen casually put a number on the life he had spent decades turning into a spectacle: 47,000 women. That was his own claim, made while looking back on the years when drugs and recklessness had become almost impossible to separate from his name. There was extreme drugs. There was alcohol. There were hotel rooms wrecked in drug-fueled binges, careers put at risk, marriages that collapsed under the pressure, and a string of incidents that eventually brought the police into his private life. In December 2009, the story stopped being funny. In Aspen, Colorado, Sheen's wife Brooke Mueller called 911 and told the operator it was a case of domestic abuse. She said Sheen had threatened her with a knife and that she was afraid for her life. Police arrived, and Sheen was arrested on suspicion of menacing, second-degree assault and criminal mischief. This was the man Hollywood had spent years rewarding for being outrageous. But there were some more disturbing things waiting in his past that would make the headlines about drugs and women look almost tame. This is the disturbing story of Charlie Sheen. Welcome to the cursed Hollywood. Charlie Sheen's first trip to rehab came in 1990. He was only 24 years old. By then, he had already become one of the most recognizable young actors in Hollywood. Platoon had made him a star. Wall Street had put him opposite Michael Douglas. Young Guns and Major League followed, and Hollywood had every reason to believe it had found one of its next great leading men. But behind that rising career, cocaine and alcohol were already becoming a problem serious enough to send him into treatment. It would not be the last time. Sheen came out of rehab and kept working. The career kept moving upward while the behavior underneath it became harder to ignore. In 1995, he appeared as a witness in the trial of Heidi Fleisch, the woman known as the Hollywood Madam. On the stand, Sheen admitted that he had spent roughly $53,000 on prostitutes. He said he had used Fleisch's service at least 27 times. It was an extraordinary amount of money for such things, but the more revealing part was what it said about the life forming around him. Charlie Sheen wasn't simply becoming famous. He was becoming accustomed to a world where money could buy almost anything he wanted, and where the consequences seemed to arrive long after the indulgence. Then came the women who were not paid to be there. In 1996, Sheen was arrested after a domestic dispute involving his former girlfriend Brittany Ashland. He later pleaded no contest to misdemeanor battery and received probation. The following year, he was still working, still famous, still being cast. And then, in 1998, the drugs nearly killed him. Sheen was hospitalized in Los Angeles after attempting to inject drugs and accidentally overdosing. His father, Martin Sheen, turned him over to authorities because the incident had also violated the terms of his probation. Charlie later described his father's decision as a devastating betrayal. That moment should have been the warning. Instead, it became another chapter in a pattern that would continue for years. He would get sober, then relapse. He would enter treatment, then return to the same world. By the time Charlie Sheen eventually became the highest-paid actor on television, the public would know him as a reckless Hollywood bad boy. What they would forget was that the warning signs had been there long before the famous breakdowns, long before Tiger Blood, and long before he began telling the world that he was winning. The man making millions from 2.5 Men was already living like someone who believed the consequences had stopped applying to him. At the height of the show, he was reportedly earning around $1.8 million for each episode. The character he played, Charlie Harper, was a wealthy, womanizing alcoholic who spent his days drinking, chasing women and making terrible decisions. It was supposed to be a sitcom. The uncomfortable part was how easily the audience could believe Sheen knew exactly what he was playing. Behind the scenes, his drug use was becoming increasingly difficult to control. His marriages were collapsing, his relationships were becoming chaotic, and rehab had stopped being a single event from his past. Then came Brooke Mueller. The two married in 2008. Both had struggled with substance abuse, and according to Sheen's later account, his relationship with Mueller became another period of heavy drinking and drug use. In his 2025 memoir, he described returning to pills and eventually using harder drugs again during the marriage. On Christmas Day in 2009, that private chaos exploded in Aspen. Brooke Mueller called 911 and reported a domestic dispute. She told the operator that Sheen had threatened her with a knife and that she was frightened for her life. Police arrived at the rented house and arrested him. The charges included menacing, second-degree assault and criminal mischief. Sheen later pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor assault charge and received probation and substance abuse treatment. For an actor whose television character made recklessness look funny, there was nothing funny about a wife calling the police because she was afraid of him. And the career still continued. That was the strange privilege of Charlie Sheen's world. Disaster could happen on Friday and Hollywood could still need him on Monday. Then, in October 2010, another incident put him back in the headlines. Sheen was found intoxicated inside a room at New York's Plaza Hotel after what was reported as a cocaine binge. Police removed him from the hotel and took him to hospital. Soon afterward, he entered rehab again. 2.5 Men was still one of television's biggest shows. But Sheen was becoming increasingly difficult to keep on the set. By early 2011, the situation finally broke. Production was halted while Sheen entered rehab. CBS canceled the remainder of the season. Warner Brothers then terminated his contract after a public war that had become almost impossible to watch without wondering whether the star had completely lost control of himself. And Sheen didn't retreat. He went straight in front of the cameras. He attacked the show's creator, Chuck Lorre. He delivered bizarre interviews in which he described himself as possessing tiger blood. He talked about winning. He mocked the people trying to get him into treatment. He turned his own collapse into a spectacle and seemed to enjoy watching the world react. The man who had once been paid millions to read someone else's lines was now generating headlines simply by opening his mouth. And somewhere underneath the cocaine, the alcohol, the marriages, the arrests and the endless headlines was a career that had been worth tens of millions of dollars and had once looked almost impossible to destroy. Charlie Sheen managed to do something Hollywood rarely sees. He became so famous that his breakdown became entertainment. For a few weeks in 2011, he had lost 2.5 Men. Warner Brothers had fired him. CBS had shut down production. And instead of disappearing, Sheen went on television and made the whole thing bigger. He talked about tiger blood. He talked about winning, mocked the people. The interviews became bizarre enough that even people who had spent years watching Sheen's excesses struggled to predict what he would say next. In April 2011, he launched the Violent Torpedo of Truth tour, selling tickets to packed theaters across America. The first shows were met with brutal reviews. Audiences walked out. Some booed. The strange thing was that his career had already survived almost everything else. Drugs had not destroyed it. Arrests had not destroyed it. Domestic violence allegations had not destroyed it. Rehab had not destroyed it. Then came another revelation. For years, Sheen had lived publicly as though consequences were something that happened to other people. He had talked openly about thousands of prostitutes' partners. He had surrounded himself with drugs and prostitutes. He had treated risk as part of the lifestyle. In 2015, the consequence arrived in 4 letters. HIV. Sheen revealed publicly that he had been diagnosed with HIV approximately 4 years earlier. The announcement changed the story completely. For years, Charlie Sheen had treated excess like a badge of honor. In November 2015, Sheen sat down with Matt Lauer and revealed something he had spent years trying to keep hidden. He was HIV positive. He said he had been diagnosed approximately 4 years earlier, in 2011, the same year his life had exploded publicly over drugs, his firing from 2.5 Men and the bizarre interviews that turned his breakdown into entertainment. Sheen said that at first he had believed he had AIDS. He didn't. He was HIV positive, and with treatment, he could manage the infection. But the diagnosis had already turned his private life into something he could no longer control. Sheen said people had demanded money from him in exchange for keeping his diagnosis secret. He described paying millions of dollars over several years to people who knew about his condition, saying the money had become a crushing financial burden. Then came the questions that made the story even uglier. Who had he slept with after his diagnosis? Who had been told? Sheen insisted that he had told his prostitutes' partners about his HIV status and that he had never intentionally exposed anyone. Other people later made accusations and filed lawsuits, creating a public dispute over what had happened and what Sheen had disclosed. Corey Haim was only a teenager when Hollywood turned him into a star. He had appeared in Lucas in 1986, alongside Charlie Sheen and Winona Ryder. Haim was young, famous, and already living inside the strange machinery of an industry that could make a child recognizable to millions while leaving him almost completely unprotected. Decades later, after Haim's death, an allegation emerged that would attach his name to one of Charlie Sheen's darkest controversies. In 2020, actor Corey Feldman released the documentary My Truth, The Grape of Two Coreys. In it, Feldman alleged that Charlie Sheen had assaulted Haim during the making of Lucas. The allegation was devastating. Sheen denied it completely. A representative for Sheen called the accusation false and said the alleged incident never happened. There has been no criminal conviction establishing that Sheen assaulted Haim. And there was another important contradiction. In 2017, Haim's mother, Judy Haim, publicly rejected the accusation against Sheen. She said that another actor, Dominic Brascia, had abused her son instead. Brascia denied the allegation before his death in 2018. So the story was never as simple as the headlines made it appear. There was Feldman's account. There was Sheen's denial. There was Haim's mother's conflicting account. And there was a child actor who was no longer alive to give his own account of what happened. That uncertainty is important because an allegation involving a dead person cannot simply be converted into a proven fact because it makes a more shocking story. But the accusation still reopened something much larger. What happened to child actors when the cameras stopped rolling? The accusation against Sheen pushed them back into the spotlight. Charlie Sheen said it never happened. The scandals were never the whole story. Charlie Sheen married Denise Richards in 2002. They had 2 daughters, Sam and Lola. By 2005, the marriage was falling apart, and Richards filed for divorce while pregnant with their second child. Their separation became ugly enough to spill into the press, with disputes over custody, support, and Sheen's behavior continuing long after the marriage itself was over. Then came Brooke Mueller. They married in 2008 and had twin sons, Bob and Max. Less than 2 years later, the Aspen incident ended with Sheen's arrest after Mueller called police and reported that he had threatened her with a knife. The marriage eventually collapsed too. By then, Sheen's life had acquired a pattern that was becoming impossible to miss. Relationships began with celebrity glamour and ended with lawyers, accusations, custody disputes or police involvement. And all the while, enormous amounts of money were passing through his hands. At the height of 2.5 Men, he was earning sums most people could barely imagine. But addiction is expensive, and so is a life built around drugs, parties, escorts, luxury homes, lawyers, and constant damage control. Then came the HIV diagnosis. Then the lawsuits and disputes surrounding it. Then years of trying to rebuild a career that had once seemed untouchable. The strange thing about Charlie Sheen's downfall was that he never completely disappeared. He kept getting work. He kept appearing in public. He kept making money. The Hollywood machine had once treated his appetite as part of his appeal. Then the same behavior started producing consequences that could not be edited out of a sitcom. His children grew up watching their father's life unfold in public. His marriages ended. In later years, Sheen spoke more openly about sobriety and the damage caused by his addiction. He acknowledged that the years of drugs and alcohol had nearly destroyed him and that getting older had forced him to look at his life differently. Just an older man trying to live with the consequences of a life that had once seemed completely out of control. He remained close to his children and continued trying to repair relationships that had been damaged during his years of addiction and public chaos. And then there was that number. 47,000. In 2025, Sheen claimed he had slept with more than 47,000 women. Even after everything, the outrageous mythology had not completely disappeared. But hearing a number like that from an older Charlie Sheen carries a different weight than it did when he was young, rich, and convinced that excess was proof of power. Because the story was never really about how many women he slept with. It was about what happened when a man was given almost everything Hollywood could offer and began believing that nothing was beyond him. Money could buy another night. Fame could make another scandal disappear. Rehab could become another chapter. A lawyer could fight another charge. A television contract could replace another one. But none of those things could make the years disappear. The HIV diagnosis could not be undone. And the people around him had to live with the consequences too. Charlie Sheen once built his identity around the idea that he was winning. Perhaps the most unsettling part of his story is that he eventually survived long enough to discover what winning had actually cost him. He had been one of Hollywood's most successful young actors. One of television's highest-paid stars. A man capable of making millions simply by walking onto a soundstage. And yet, for years, the thing he seemed least capable of controlling was himself. The world watched him burn through fame, money, relationships, health and reputation. And somehow, when the smoke finally cleared, Charlie Sheen was still standing. Not untouched. Not innocent of the chaos surrounding him. Not the invincible man he once claimed to be. Just alive, older, and left with the one thing fame had never been able to give him, the chance to look back.